Welcome to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing, founder of the Reiki Business Collective and creator of the Build Your Reiki Business program, sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Greetings, welcome, and thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode of the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. I'm Christian of Standing Stones Healing. I am grateful to have you here yet again this week, so thank you so very much. In this week's episode, we're talking about podcasts. Yes, having a podcast for your Reiki business. But first, I want to make sure to invite you to the February 10th workshop on how to build your distance Reiki business. This is a 2-hour workshop talking all about how to build your distance Reiki business, including and particularly online. You can learn more and register at the link down below. It would be wonderful to have you join us. Yes, indeed, you do get the recording. And yes, indeed, I am also honored to send you, as a thank you for joining, the Be a Content Boss workshop recording. This is an excellent supplement to the workshop, and I am happy to send that to you as well for registering. I hope you can join us. Thank you. So, podcasts for your Reiki business. I will say that I am pretty young on my podcasting journey. I have been hosting Build Your Reiki Business since March of 2023. And on one hand, that's pretty young for a podcast. On the other hand, that's pretty old for a podcast, because what we know is that many people will start a podcast and they'll record a few episodes and then they're done. They lose interest. It's no longer something that they want to do. It's no longer something that they want to keep up with. And they find, quite frankly, that it's a lot more effort than they thought, or that they want to bother with, or they're not getting their return on their investment that they would like. And so I've only been at this for a year, but in the world of podcasting, it actually doesn't take long to have a podcast that's older than most podcasts. Now, I talk about podcasting just as a brief mention in a previous Build Your Reiki Business episode about ways to have a Reiki business online without social media. And a podcast is really great for this. And a podcast is really great because a podcast is not social media in the traditional social media kind of sense. One reason that a lot of people don't like social media is because of the comments, the negative feedback, and what people might say and the kinds of reactions that they might get. Well, a podcast is great because for the most part, it's just you doing the talking. It's you putting out the content, and on some platforms, people can respond, like on YouTube, for instance. And yes, people can leave reviews. By the way, please do feel free to leave a positive review for the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. And if you would prefer to not leave a positive review, please reach out and tell me why you don't like the podcast. But that typical thumbs up, thumbs down, comment kind of response that we get on social media is not the same on a podcast. And so on a podcast, you're able to put your thoughts and ideas and views out there without the same kind of feedback that you might get. I mean, for good or ill, right? there are some real positives for our Reiki business with the kinds of reactions that we might get on other social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram. But what's great about a podcast is that you are able to show up in people's ears and people are able to get to know you. This is one of the great things about video as well and YouTube as well. Last week's episode was about YouTube. And of course, being able to see you and your mannerisms and how you show up on video is really helpful for people to get to know you. And so podcasting is really helpful in the same kind of way. Now, people can't see you. Of course, we can do video podcasts these days, and there are video podcasts out there. But even if you have an audio-only podcast like Build Your Reiki Business, people are still able to hear you and to get to know you through your voice. I'm always so honored when people tell me, Christian, I listen to the podcast when I'm driving to work. Or Christian, I listen when I am cooking. Or Christian, I listen when I'm in the shower. Yes, I'm honored by that. Thank you. And so if you are considering a podcast on your Reiki business journey, it indeed can be a really great way for people to get to know you, to get to know your Reiki business, and to determine if you and your Reiki business, what you're offering, are a good fit for them. I can tell you that I've had plenty of people join the Build Your Reiki Business program because they've listened to the podcast and they've gotten to know me through the podcast and they've heard my thoughts and they've been able to say, I think this guy knows what he's talking about. And if he's sharing this information on the podcast, what else is he sharing in the program? By the way, yes, indeed, a whole lot more. And how else can he help me? And so that means that the podcast has been helpful in my own Reiki business for showing people what my Reiki business does, how I can help them, and helping them determine whether or not they might like to get to know me better inside the Build Your Reiki Business program. And if the podcast helps them determine that it's not the right fit for them, that they don't like me, my voice is annoying, or I say too many ums or uhs or whatever it might be, that's great too. It is also really great when we help people determine that we're not the right fit for them so that they can find another practitioner who is the right fit for them. So it's all a win-win. Now, if you're thinking about a podcast for your Reiki business, there are some important things that I want to pass along to you in setting up that podcast. First of all, you'll want to choose your platform. Now, when I say podcast, you can indeed house your podcast on YouTube. So these Build Your Reiki Business episodes are on YouTube, but they are in addition to a podcast platform. So you can have your podcast only on YouTube, but I also recommend having it on a podcast platform because it will get greater reach that way. There are people who listen to Build Your Reiki Business on a podcast platform who don't listen to it on YouTube. And there are people who find the Build Your Reiki Business podcast specifically through a podcast platform and start listening there, people who wouldn't have found it on YouTube, for instance. And so if you're going to have a podcast, I recommend putting it both on a podcast platform and YouTube. Why not? But the first thing you'll want to do is to choose your podcast platform. Now, I chose for mine Spotify, so my podcast is housed on Spotify. And I started, a few years ago, Spotify used to have a free podcast platform called Anchor. And I had my Q&A series. I have an old Q&A series called Ask the Stones. And I did that on YouTube, but then I started putting the episodes on Anchor too, and stopped those episodes and stopped uploading them to Anchor. Actually, I think I stopped uploading them to Anchor before I stopped recording them and putting them on YouTube. But anyway, Anchor then went away, and Spotify just has Spotify for podcasters. The great news is this is still a free platform. Now, of course, you can use other platforms like BuzzFeed or, of course, Apple. Some of them have a fee attached to them. And you are often limited in terms of the number of hours you can upload for free per month and other kinds of things. But right now, I have my podcast on Spotify for podcasters, and personally, I'm happy with it. One of the things that is important to note, no matter where you have your podcast housed on a podcast platform, is what's called the RSS feed. And this is very important because your podcast will have its own unique RSS feed link. And in order for your podcast to show up on podcast platforms, you need to take that link and upload it, connect it to other podcast platforms. So what that meant for me with Build Your Reiki Business, I have it housed on Spotify. But in order to show up on Apple Podcasts, I had to create an Apple Podcasts and Apple login. I did not have one previously. Let me tell you, that was a real pain in the butt, like, holy cow. If I had hair, I would have been pulling it out. But I had to create a username and login on Apple. I had to do some special things to then be able to to connect my RSS feed. I don't want to say upload because it sounds like I was uploading a file. It wasn't that. I was connecting my RSS feed link to Apple so that Build Your Reiki Business shows up on Apple Podcasts. So it's searchable on Apple. I had to do that with other platforms too, iHeartRadio, and just some other platforms so that my podcast would show up in those search results. This was the most challenging aspect for me of setting up my podcast. This was the hardest part about setting up Build Your Reiki Business. It was a pain. I had no idea what a challenge it would be on the back end and what a pain in the butt. But thankfully, it's done. Thankfully, you can find Build Your Reiki Business across multiple platforms. And thankfully, I don't have to do that again. Well, at least not right now. Phew. So please be aware that if you are going to set up a podcast on a podcast platform, you've got to do that dreaded RSS thing so that your podcast is searchable across platforms. But once it is, one of the great things is that your podcast will be recommended to listeners. And so your podcast will have what are called impressions, where the platform will suggest your podcast. So you know how you're on a podcast platform and you get the feed that's like, you might also like to listen to, or listeners of this podcast also listen to this podcast. And so your podcast may very well show up in those results. Those are impressions. And I've had people find my podcast, Build Your Reiki Business, because of those impressions. So thank you, Spotify, for the free advertising. Things that are really helpful for you with your podcast and getting the word out about it are things like the cover art for the podcast. So making sure that you have appealing cover art. This would be like a thumbnail on YouTube in terms of the importance of catching someone's eye. Now, I'm not the best with these things, full disclosure. And the cover art for Build Your Reiki Business has changed. It probably will change again, but that's always an evolving process, of course. But having nice cover art is helpful. It can also be helpful to have a cover art for each episode that shows what the episode is about. I don't bother to do this. I know best practices say I should, and best practices say that I would probably have more viewers, more listeners if I did. And also, I do a lot of stuff with my Reiki business. And so that's just one thing that I don't bother with as much right now on my Reiki business journey. But podcast cover art can be really helpful. Another thing that is helpful for your podcast, of course, and even more important than your cover art, is your audience. Who are you recording your podcast for? Who are you reaching out to? Who do you want your listenership to be? And you might be thinking, Christian, anyone who is going to book a session with me, duh. Well, okay. Sure, but who do you really want to be tuning in? Who do you want to be listening to your podcast? For instance, the audience for Build Your Reiki Business is Reiki practitioners who are considering starting a business and Reiki business owners. That's it. And because of that, my reach for Build Your Reiki Business is less than it might be if I had a more general audience. At the same time, people can tell pretty quickly and pretty easily whether or not this is the podcast for them. If you're still listening to this episode this far into it, I can tell you that you already have determined that this podcast is for you. And if you're not a Reiki practitioner, or even if you're not a spiritually minded kind of person, or if you're not a Reiki business owner, not considering starting a Reiki business, then you've probably already determined that this podcast isn't for you, and you're probably not listening. So thank you to everyone who is still listening. You are my people. But having a defined audience is really going to help you to know the kinds of things that you want to be talking about in your podcast, the kinds of things that you want to be addressing, the kinds of content that you want to be creating, and the kinds of discussions that you want to have. As far as those discussions, a point of consideration for your podcast is to ask yourself, do you want to have a solo podcast? Do you want to partner with someone else? By the way, partnerships for podcasts are great because there's more than one person that is promoting the podcast. When it's just you, you're the one, and if you have a team, are the ones promoting the podcast. But if you have someone else who's hosting the podcast with you, you have someone else to share in spreading the word. But is it going to be a solo podcast? Build Your Reiki Business is a solo podcast. I don't have guests. Or are you going to have guests? I can tell you, as someone who also hosts the Reiki Business Collective interview series on my YouTube channel, on the Standing Stones Healing YouTube channel, that brings in an added layer of difficulty with scheduling, finding the time, sitting down to have the conversation. It's a much more involved process, and I can tell you that it is way easier to record solo podcasts. As someone who does the Reiki Business Collective interviews with Reiki business owners, I purposefully wanted to have Build Your Reiki Business as a solo podcast, simply for the sake of ease. Length of time is another consideration as you are starting your podcast. How long do you want your episodes to be? We hear now that, people have short attention spans. People don't listen to long form content. You put a long video on YouTube, no one's going to watch it. You have an hour-long podcast, no one's going to listen to it. That's actually not true. It is not true that people don't listen to things that are long form. And it's not true that people won't listen or tune in to a long video or podcast episode. What is true is that people are more choosy. People are pickier with so many things to listen to, so much content to consume. It's not that people will not listen to an hour-long podcast. It's that people won't listen to an hour-long podcast if they're not getting value from it, if it's not interesting or entertaining or something that is fulfilling a need or a desire that they have. They'll click off and find something else to listen to or watch. And so long-form content is not dead. That is simply not true. And people's attention spans, are they shorter than they used to be? Maybe, but not if the stuff is good. Not if it's something that they want, not if it is fulfilling a need. And so if you want to have hour-long conversations, there are people who are going to tune in. If you want to have you just talking for an hour, there are people who are going to tune in. So know that it's not about the length, it's about what you're doing in that amount of time, and it's about the person tuning in, the audience tuning in. If it meets their needs, if they want to listen, they will. Now, I decided on shorter episodes for the Build Your Reiki Business podcast because the truth is there is so much to say on any of the topics that we might talk about from week to week, and I could go for hours and hours on all of these. And I don't know about you, but there are a lot of other things that I might like to tune into, that I might like to consume. And so if you're like me, you want the information, you want helpful stuff, and then you want to get on with your day. I am a major proponent of 20-minute stuff. So for instance, 20-minute spiritual practices. I'm a huge proponent of 20-minute spiritual practices, like 20 minutes of meditating, 20 minutes of walking, 20 minutes of journaling. I think there's something really powerful about 20 minutes. And so my vision for Build Your Reiki Business starting out was 20-minute episodes. Now, many of these episodes will go over the 20-minute mark just because I'm a little verbose, I like to talk a lot, and I have a lot to say. But I like to keep them shorter and keep them reined in order to help me get to the point. So as with all of these episodes, yes, indeed, there is so much to say. And of course, there is so much more to say about Reiki business in general. That's why there's a whole Build Your Reiki Business program on it. And of course, as always, you can learn more about the Build Your Reiki Business program at standingstoneshealing.com/build. But do you have a podcast for your Reiki business? Are you thinking about starting a podcast? Please join us in the Reiki Business Collective Facebook group and tell us all about it. It's at facebook.com/groups/Reiki Biz. Well, whether you have a podcast or not, I'm sending so many blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business. Thanks for tuning in to the Build Your Reiki Business podcast. Please like, share, subscribe, and send to a friend. Learn more about the Build Your Reiki Business program at standingstoneshealing.com/build. Sending blessings and best wishes to your Reiki business.